She entered that house as the younger brother's girlfriend and left with her heart already with the older brother. But between that beginning and the end lay blood, betrayal, and a criminal empire crumbling before her eyes. Selene Vale wasn't looking for this. No one seeks the kind of love that destroys everything before it saves you. But when Kael Ashcroft looked straight into her eyes in the darkness of that hallway, she knew her life would never be the same again. Like and comment the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Now, let's begin. Chicago in November was not a city. It was a wound that refused to close. The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday evening, not the soft, romantic kind that blurred streetlights into impressionist paintings, but the mean, vindictive kind, cold and horizontal, the kind that soaked through coats in 30 seconds and found the gap between collar and neck like a deliberate insult. Selene Vale sat rigid in the passenger seat of Damian's silver Audi, watching the city slide past her window in smears of red and yellow neon, her right knee bouncing involuntarily, a habit she'd never managed to kill no matter how many therapy sessions she'd attended or how many mornings she'd spent on a yoga mat trying to breathe herself into stillness. "You're doing the knee thing," Damian said. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the road, both hands on the wheel at the exact correct positions, exactly the way he did everything, correctly, carefully, with the gentle precision of a man who had never once in his life done anything without calculating the consequences first. His jaw was clean-shaved, his dark hair was perfectly combed despite the humidity. He smelled like cedar and something expensive. "I'm fine," Selene said. "You said that before we left your apartment." "Because I was fine then too." He reached across the console and put his hand over her bouncing knee. His fingers were warm. That was one of the things she'd noticed first about Damian Ashcroft 14 months ago, when a mutual friend introduced them at a gallery opening. His hands were always warm. It was the kind of small physical detail that accumulated into something like security if you let it. She had let it. She'd been deliberate about letting it. The way you're deliberate about building something after you've spent years watching other things burn down. "They're gonna love you," he said. Selene said nothing. She pressed her palm flat against her own thigh to stop the bouncing and watched the city give way to something older and heavier as they crossed into the Gold Coast. The buildings here were different. Less glass and ambition, more stone and silence. The kind of architecture that wasn't built to impress. It was built to endure. The Ashcroft estate sat behind iron gates at the end of a private drive lined with oaks that had been old when Chicago was still a frontier town. The house itself was 4 stories of pale limestone, every window lit from within, throwing amber light across the wet gravel. 2 men stood at the gate in dark raincoats. They didn't wave or smile. They just looked at the Audi with the flat, professional attention of people who had been hired specifically for their ability to make guests feel subtly unwelcome. Damian rolled down his window, said his name. The gate opened. Selene pulled in a breath and held it. Inside the house, everything was exactly as suffocating as she'd anticipated. The entry hall was cathedral-ceilinged, marble-floored, hung with oil portraits of men in dark suits who all shared the same sharp jaw and the same expression. Something between authority and contempt. A housekeeper took their coats without speaking. Someone was playing piano somewhere deeper in the house, something classical and technically flawless that nonetheless managed to sound cold. Damian's hand found the small of her back, guiding, presenting. The dining room held 8 people already. Selene cataloged them in the rapid, automatic way she'd developed over years of entering rooms where she didn't belong. 3 men she didn't recognize in business casual that cost more than her monthly rent. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, who Damian introduced as his Aunt Helena, 2 younger women she couldn't immediately place, and at the head of the long mahogany table, the patriarch, Everett Ashcroft. He was 70, but wore it like a threat rather than a fact. Heavy through the shoulders, white-haired, with eyes the color of old nickels, and the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades in rooms where other people were afraid of him and found it perfectly natural. He rose when Damian brought Selene forward, and he took her hand, and he smiled, and every instinct she possessed fired simultaneously like a circuit breaker tripping. "Selene," he said, as if he were tasting the word. "Damian's told us very little about you. I find that interesting." I'm a private person, she said. So is everyone who has something to hide. He said it lightly, as if it were a joke, and the people around the table laughed the way people laugh at the patriarch's jokes. Quickly, automatically, without checking first to see if it was funny. Damian laughed too. Selene watched him do it and felt something flatten inside her chest. She was seated between Damian and Aunt Helena, which meant she spent the first 40 minutes of dinner fielding questions disguised as conversation. What she did, where she'd grown up, whether she owned or rented, how long she'd known Damian, whether she had family in the city. Helena asked them all with the pleasant, unrelenting efficiency of a woman conducting an interview she'd already decided the outcome of. Selene answered everything carefully, truthfully, in the short declarative sentences that left the least room for misinterpretation. She'd learned to do that a long time ago, in a different life, when the wrong answer to the wrong question could escalate into something that left marks. She was halfway through a story about her yoga studio that she suspected nobody at the table cared about when the dining room door opened. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps exactly, but a kind of weight displacement, the room reorganizing itself subtly around a new presence, the way water shifts when something large enters it. Several conversations paused, postures changed. It was fractional, almost imperceptible, but Selene's nervous system caught it and flagged it immediately. Kael Ashcroft was soaked. His black wool coat was dark with rain from the shoulders down, and he hadn't bothered to remove it before entering the dining room. He was taller than Damian by 3 inches, broader through the chest and shoulders, built less like someone who worked out and more like someone who had spent years doing things with his body that left no room for vanity. His hair was dark and wet and pushed back from his face. A scar ran across the knuckles of his right hand in a thin white line, old enough to have faded but permanent. Another one disappeared at the collar of his shirt, heading somewhere Selene couldn't see. He scanned the table the way you scan a room when you've spent enough time in dangerous places that it becomes reflex. Fast, comprehensive, cataloging exits and threats and faces in the same automatic sweep. His eyes moved across Selene without stopping, then swept back and stopped. 1 second, maybe less. Then he pulled out the empty chair across from Everett without apologizing for his lateness and sat down. "You're wet," Everett said. "It's raining," Kael said. That was the entirety of their greeting. Damian leaned toward Selene and said quietly, "That's my brother." And she realized she'd been holding her breath without noticing. She released it, said nothing. Kael didn't speak much through dinner. He ate. He answered direct questions in the fewest possible words. When someone at the table made a joke he found insufficiently funny, his face registered absolutely nothing, which somehow communicated his assessment more effectively than laughter would have. He drank 2 fingers of whiskey and didn't refill the glass. The business associates seemed to orbit slightly away from him, even at a distance of several feet, the way metal filings orient themselves around a magnetic field but don't actually touch it. Selene was careful not to look at him too often. She was aware of failing at this. It wasn't attraction, she told herself, or it wasn't only attraction, or it wasn't attraction in any form she recognized or wanted. It was something more like the feeling you got standing too close to the edge of something high, not desire for the fall, but the body's involuntary acknowledgement that the fall was possible. She excused herself during dessert, claiming the bathroom, needing 30 seconds of air and silence and the ability to breathe without anyone watching her do it. The bathroom was at the end of a long hallway that turned left past a library, and she found it without asking, moving quickly through the amber-lit corridor with its oil paintings and its thick carpet that swallowed all sound. He was standing beside the last window before the hallway turned. She nearly walked past him. The window was cracked an inch despite the cold, and he was holding a cigarette in 2 fingers, the ember a small orange point in the dimness, letting the smoke curl out through the gap. He was still in his coat, still damp, utterly still in the particular way that large men with violent histories go still. Not relaxed, exactly. More like contained. Selene stopped walking. There were 3 feet between them, and it felt like too little. "I didn't know anyone smoked in here," she said, because she had to say something. "They don't." He didn't look at her. He was watching the rain hit the window glass, tracking individual drops with what appeared to be genuine attention. "My father hates it." "Then why?" "Because he hates it." She should have kept walking. She knew that clearly and precisely in the way you know things when your body is trying to communicate something your mind refuses to receive. Instead, she stood there in the dim hallway while rain hammered the glass and the sounds of dinner conversation drifted distantly from the other end of the house like noise from another world. "You look terrified," he said, still not looking at her. "I'm not. No." A pause. He turned his head then and looked at her directly, and up close his eyes were a particular shade of gray-blue that she didn't have a name for and didn't want one. "You look like someone who's been terrified so many times they learned how to wear it like a neutral expression." The accuracy of that landed somewhere unpleasant. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "You're right." Turned back to the window. Took a last drag and pinched the cigarette out between his fingers without flinching, tucking the dead butt into his coat pocket rather than dropping it. "You should probably go back." "I was going to the bathroom." "I know, go to the bathroom." He said it without inflection, not dismissive, not polite, just factual, like a man issuing a quiet warning that had nothing to do with bathrooms. "And when you come back, sit closer to Damian. Keep your eyes off me for the rest of the night." The presumption of it hit her like a slap. "Excuse me, you've looked at me 7 times during dinner." Still just factual, still looking at the rain. "I counted. Damian hasn't noticed yet." Her face went hot. She was glad for the dim light. I know what it was." He finally looked at her again, and this time there was something in his expression that she couldn't classify. Not cruelty, not attraction, something more exhausted than either of those things. "Go back to dinner, Selene." Her name in his mouth. She didn't move for a moment. Then she walked past him to the bathroom and locked the door and stood at the sink running cold water over her wrists, the way she did when a panic attack was building. A technique her therapist had given her that she'd never admitted to anyone except the one person who prescribed it. She stared at herself in the mirror above the sink. Her dark hair was still pinned correctly. Her mascara was intact. Her expression was, in fact, perfectly neutral. She looked like a woman who had been terrified so many times she'd learned how to wear it like a neutral expression. She pressed her wet wrist to the side of her neck and breathed. When she came back out, the hallway was empty. The next 3 weeks were supposed to be simple. She'd met the family. She'd survived it. She'd go back to her studio, teach her classes, talk with Damian about the trip to Portugal they'd half planned for February, eat Sunday dinners at his apartment, and file away the evening at the Ashcroft estate as a thing that had happened and didn't need to happen again for a long while. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It was the kind of plan that a reasonable person with any self-preservation instinct whatsoever would have executed without difficulty. She saw Kael again 8 days later at a charity gala on Michigan Avenue. Damian had mentioned it the week before, an arts foundation his family co-sponsored, annual event. Attendance was basically mandatory for anyone connected to the Ashcroft name. Selene had agreed to go. She'd bought a black dress. She'd spent 40 minutes on her hair. She'd arrived on Damian's arm feeling genuinely fine, genuinely present, genuinely committed to enjoying an evening of catered food and string quartets and conversations about philanthropic giving with people whose net worth made hers look like a rounding error. Kael was standing at the far end of the room when they entered. He was in a dark suit this time. No rain, no wet coat. He cleaned up the way men like him always cleaned up. Not better, exactly, just more contained. The suit was fitted, but not fashion-forward. He was talking to 2 men who stood with the particular rigid posture of people who were technically socially present, but actually professionally on duty. Their eyes swept the room in practiced arcs, while Kael talked to them in low, quick sentences, and when he finished talking, both men dispersed into the crowd with the smooth efficiency of something choreographed. Damian steered Selene toward the bar and began working the room the way he always did. Smoothly, warmly, with the practiced social ease of a man raised to perform his own likability as a professional skill. He was good at it. He introduced her, included her, made space for her in conversations, remembered to bring her a glass of wine without her asking. He was, by every reasonable metric, exactly the kind of partner she'd spent years believing she needed. She noticed when Kael moved across the room. She noticed when he stepped onto the terrace. She noticed, approximately 7 minutes later, that she was on the terrace too, leaning against the railing 30 stories above the city, with the wind pulling at her dress and the traffic below reduced to abstract light patterns. and the pretense of fresh air doing nothing to explain why she'd come out here. He was smoking again, same two-finger grip. He registered her presence without turning around. "You're persistent," he said. "I came out for air." "Sure." The terrace was empty except for the two of them. The wind was sharp and cold and smelled like the lake. Below, Chicago sprawled in every direction, dense and indifferent, the kind of city that absorbed your presence without particularly noting it. Selene gripped the railing and looked out at it and tried to locate, somewhere in her chest, the thing that would tell her to go back inside. "What do you actually do?" she asked. "Damian says security operations." "That's accurate." "It's vague." "Also accurate." She turned and looked at him directly. "Those men you were talking to inside. They're not event security." He finally looked at her, took a long moment assessing her face. "No," he said. "They're not." "So what are they?" "People who make sure other people don't have problems." He said it simply, without drama, the way you'd describe a mundane job function. "Are you going to ask me more questions I won't answer, or are you planning on going back inside at some point?" "Why won't you answer them?" "Because you don't want to know the answers." He dropped the cigarette, killed it underfoot, turned toward her fully for the first time, which put them at a proximity that the wind and the narrowness of the terrace made feel immediately intimate. "And I don't mean that as a threat. I mean it as, you've built something careful for yourself. Damian, the studio, the routine, it works for you. The answers to your questions would break all of that." "You don't know what works for me. I know you run 3 miles every morning before your first class." She went very still. "I know you had a relationship before Damian that ended badly enough that you flinch when men raise their voices unexpectedly. I know your left shoulder tightens when you're in a room you can't easily exit. I know you've been in 12 of those rooms tonight, and you've checked the door every time." The wind pushed her hair across her face. She didn't move to fix it. "You had me watched," she said. "I have everyone connected to this family looked at. It's not personal." "It feels personal." Something moved across his face. Barely. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It does." They stood there for a moment in which the wind and the noise of 30 floors of city below them and the muffled sound of a string quartet through the glass felt like the only things preventing the silence between them from becoming something irreversible. Then the terrace door opened and Damian was standing in it, jacket open, wine glass in hand, scanning for her, and finding them both, and his face doing the thing that Damian's face did when he processed something uncomfortable, going carefully, deliberately, smooth. "There you are," he said to Selene. His voice was easy. "I was looking for you." "Just getting air," she said. "Your brother happened to be out here." Damian's eyes moved to Kael. Kael looked back at him with an expression that communicated nothing. Brother silence, the kind accumulated across decades of history and resentment and love that had been left so long unattended, it had fermented into something more complex than either of those original ingredients. "Come back in," Damian said to Selene, gentle, still easy. "Helena wants to meet you properly." She went back in. She didn't look back at Kael. She felt him watching her go. The next 2 weeks produced 3 more encounters she hadn't planned for, and one she had, which was worse. A late Sunday gathering at a rooftop penthouse belonging to one of Damian's business partners, where Kael arrived at 11 and left at midnight and managed in that single hour to have 2 separate conversations with her that felt more substantive than most relationships she'd been in. A corporate dinner where she sat diagonally from him and spent the entire evening focusing extremely hard on the person actually speaking to her. A chance collision at the elevator bank of Damian's building, Kael coming up, Selene going down, the doors opening on each other, a moment of mutual acknowledgement so stripped of pretense that it was almost funny. And then the Sunday evening at Damian's apartment where he came up after dinner for something he said he'd left in Damian's study. And instead of the 5 minutes that should have been, he and Selene ended up standing in the kitchen while Damian was on a call, with a bottle of wine and no conversation, and the unbearable specific gravity of 2 people who had been refusing to acknowledge something for long enough that the refusal had become its own kind of declaration. "You're going to hurt him," Kael said. He wasn't accusing her. He sounded tired. "I'm not doing anything," Selene said. "Neither am I." He poured himself a glass of water, not wine, set the glass down, looked at the kitchen counter rather than her. "That's the problem." She hated him, briefly and cleanly, for naming it. "You could stop coming around," she said. This is my family." "Then I could." He looked at her sharply at that. Something flickered in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Something that might have been alarm if she'd been reading him correctly, which she wasn't certain she was capable of doing. "Don't do that," he said. "Damian would—" "I know what Damian would do. That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it." A long silence. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the apartment, through two closed doors, Damian's voice rose and fell in the cadence of a business call. "This isn't going to end well," Kael said finally. "No," Selene agreed. "It's not." He left 12 minutes after that before Damian got off the phone. She heard the apartment door close. She stood in the kitchen with 2 glasses of wine and the particular feeling of someone who has just watched the first domino fall and can already see, perfectly clearly, the entire cascade that follows. And who cannot, no matter how clearly they see it, make themselves reach out and stop it. She drank her wine. She drank his, too. When Damian came out of the study, flushed from the call, apologetic, immediately solicitous, asking if she was okay, she said yes and meant it in the only way she was capable of meaning it anymore, which was to say she was intact and present and still technically in the arrangement they'd agreed to, and that would have to be enough. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. She stood at the kitchen window of his apartment later that night, after he'd fallen asleep, and looked at Chicago below in the rain. It was raining again. It was always raining in November. And felt the pressure of everything she wasn't doing pressing outward from her chest like a thing trying to get out. And she thought about what Kael had said that first night in the dim hallway. "You should be. Not don't be afraid. Not you're safe." Just the flat, accurate acknowledgement that the fear was appropriate, that the situation warranted it, that some warnings come not from weakness, but from precise information correctly processed. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. The rain came down. And 3 days later, in the underground parking garage beneath Kael's building, in the 10 seconds after an argument that had started about nothing and become about everything, with her back against the concrete pillar and his breathing loud and ragged and his eyes on her face with the desperate look of a man who had been holding something back for so long that the holding itself had become unbearable. She kissed him, or he kissed her. She was never afterward certain which was true, and suspected it didn't matter because the distinction between moving toward something and letting it arrive had become, at that point, entirely theoretical. The kiss was not gentle. It was not the beginning of something. It felt like the end, the specific, obliterating finality of a thing you've been trying to prevent for so long that when it finally happens, the overriding sensation is not desire, but relief. And beneath the relief, immediately, the cold, clear recognition of what you've just done. She pulled back first. Kael stood with his eyes closed for a moment, jaw set, chest rising and falling. Then the sound reached them both. Footsteps, a car door, and from 20 feet away across the concrete dimness of the parking structure, Damian's voice saying her name. Not shouting it, just saying it. In the particular tone of a man who has just understood something that cannot be ununderstood. Selene turned. Damian stood in the fluorescent half-light with his keys in his hand and his face doing that terrible, careful smoothing thing, and this time it wasn't working. This time whatever was underneath the smooth was too large and too broken to stay contained, and she watched the exact moment it stopped working and the thing underneath showed through. He looked at his brother. Kael looked back. Nobody said anything for a long moment that lasted several lifetimes. Then Damian turned and walked back toward the elevator without speaking, and the sound of his footsteps was perfectly steady, perfectly controlled, and that was somehow the worst thing of all. That even now, even in this, Damian Ashcroft walked away from devastation, like a man who had been trained since childhood that the most important thing was never to let anyone see you break. Selene stood in the parking garage with the cold fluorescent light and the smell of wet concrete and the specific, irreversible weight of what had just ended. Kael didn't move. Didn't speak. Somewhere above them, an elevator door closed, and whatever fragile, careful thing Selene had spent 14 months building was already, completely, and permanently gone. The elevator doors had been closed for 4 minutes before either of them moved. Selene counted. She didn't mean to count, but her brain did it automatically, the way it defaulted to measurable things when everything unmeasurable was falling apart. 4 minutes of standing in a parking garage beneath humming fluorescent lights, with the smell of motor oil and wet concrete and the specific silence of a man who was deciding something. Kael moved first. Not toward her. Toward his car. A black Range Rover parked 2 spaces to her left, and he put both hands flat on the roof and stood there with his head down and his shoulders up around his ears like a man taking a punch. He'd known was coming and had been bracing for so long his body had forgotten how to do anything else. "Go home," he said. "Kael, Selene." His voice came out stripped of everything. No edge, no control, none of the flat precision she'd become accustomed to. Just the raw, tired underside of it. "Go home." She picked up her bag from the ground where it had fallen. She didn't remember dropping it. She walked to her car, a gray Honda that looked aggressively civilian next to everything else in the Ashcroft building's garage, and she sat inside it for 3 minutes without starting the engine, gripping the steering wheel with both hands and watching her own knuckles go white. Then she drove. Damian did not answer his phone that night, or the next morning, or the following afternoon. His texts were read without response. She could see the check marks, could see the exact moment her words arrived and were received and were deliberately left alone in the way that only the truly hurt leave things alone, not in anger, but in the awful, quiet dignity of someone trying to decide whether they still have enough of themselves left to respond with. She taught her classes. She moved through sun salutations and warrior sequences with 17 students who needed nothing from her except instruction and presence. And she gave them both, and nobody in that bright mirrored room could have known that she was running on autopilot so complete it was almost peaceful. The body knew these movements. The body could do this without her. She let it. On the 3rd day, Damian called. She answered before the first ring had finished. "I need to see you," he said. His voice was even, controlled, the way his footsteps had been controlled in the parking garage, that practiced, terrible steadiness. "Okay," she said. "Tell me where." He named a coffee shop near his office, neutral territory, a place they'd been to dozens of times together. The familiarity of it was worse than if he'd chosen somewhere new. She arrived 8 minutes early and sat at their usual table and felt the specific cruelty of habit, how it keeps insisting on normalcy long after normalcy has become inapplicable. He walked in at exactly the time he'd said. He was in his work clothes, gray suit, open collar, no tie. He looked like he hadn't slept. Not the dramatic movie version of sleeplessness with red eyes and visible despair, but the subtler kind. A slight heaviness around the jaw, a muted quality to his usual precision, like a machine running at 90%. He sat down. He looked at her. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "How long?" he said finally. Not a question. The intonation was completely flat. "Nothing happened before that night. I need you to know that." "How long has it been building?" Still flat. Still not a question. She thought about lying. Not for long. "Since I met him." Something moved across his face and was immediately suppressed. He looked down at the table. His hands were flat on the surface, fingers spread, the way you press your hands flat when you need to ground yourself physically, because your mind is doing something you can't let it do in public. She knew that gesture. She'd done it herself. "Did you want it to?" he asked. "No." "But you didn't stop it." "No." He absorbed that. His jaw moved once, a small, tight flex, and then he was still again. "Was it—" He stopped, started over. "Was any of this real?" "Us." "Yes." The word came out raw. "Damian, yes, what we had was real." Past tense. She didn't correct it. He sat back, looked at the window beside their table, at the street outside where people moved past with their coffees and their phones and their unremarkable Tuesdays. "He's my brother," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "I know. You know." He looked back at her, and for the first time the control cracked, just at the edges, something bleak and scalded showing through. "You know? Okay. Yeah." He pressed his fingers to his eyes briefly, dropped his hand. "I need you to not contact me for a while." "Okay." "I don't mean a few days, I mean—" He stopped. "I need to figure out what I'm doing. With the business, with my family. I can't do that if I'm—" Another stop. He was being so careful with his words, and it was breaking her apart. "I'll be okay. I just need—" "Okay," she said again. Because there was nothing else. Because he was being so measured and so dignified and so genuinely, quietly devastated that anything more complex than compliance felt like cruelty. He left first. He touched her hand on the table as he stood up. One brief contact, his warm fingers over her knuckles, and she had time to think that it was the last time, probably, that his hands would feel warm to her. And then he was gone. She sat at the table for 20 minutes after. The coffee went cold. She didn't drink it. She did not contact Kael. She made that decision deliberately, consciously, with the specific discipline of a woman who had dismantled one addiction in her early 20s and remembered clearly enough how that had worked. Not willpower exactly, but redirection. The constant low-grade effort of choosing, every day, every hour if necessary, to put your energy somewhere that didn't poison you. She taught classes. She reorganized her studio's schedule. She had dinner twice with her only close friend in the city, a woman named Petra, who asked pointed questions and received careful non-answers and was too good a friend to push, but too perceptive not to notice that something had been broken. "You look like someone who made a decision they're not sure about," Petra said over wine on a Wednesday. "I make those constantly," Selene said. "This one looks bigger than usual." Selene drank her wine. "Can we talk about your thing with the architect instead?" Petra let it go. That was what Petra was good at, knowing exactly where the line was and respecting it, which was rarer than it should have been and which Selene had learned to be genuinely grateful for. 12 days after the parking garage. 12 days of managed distance and redirected energy and the specific low-grade grief of something ending that you don't have the right to mourn publicly. Then Kael called. She stared at his name on her screen for 4 rings. On the 5th, she answered. "I need to talk to you." His voice was tight, not cold, tighter than cold, wound around something specific and urgent. "In person, not at either of our buildings." "Why?" "Because I don't want this conversation on a phone." A pause. "There's a bar on West Hubbard, Marin's. You know it?" "I know it." 40 minutes. He hung up. She went. Marin's was the kind of bar that had been the same bar since 1987, and was proud of it. Dark wood, bad lighting, a jukebox nobody touched anymore, a bartender named something like Gerald, who had seen everything and found none of it interesting. Kael was in a corner booth when she arrived, not at the bar, positioned with his back against the wall and a clear line of sight to the door. He had a bourbon in front of him that he hadn't touched. He was in dark jeans and a gray shirt, no jacket, which was wrong for November and made her think he'd left somewhere in a hurry. She slid into the booth across from him. "What happened?" she said. "My father had a meeting yesterday." He kept his voice low, even, the tone calibrated to carry no further than the 2 feet between them. "With Harlan Voss." The name meant nothing to her, and apparently her face showed it. "Voss runs distribution for the Meridian Group," Kael said. "They operate out of the Northwest side. We've had a boundary arrangement with them for 6 years. Nobody crosses into the other's operations. It works because both sides benefit from it working." He picked up the bourbon, set it back down. "My father met with Voss without telling me anything." "What does that mean?" "It means one of 2 things. Either my father is negotiating something he doesn't want me to know about," he paused, "or he's replacing me with something Voss can provide." "Replacing you as in the function I serve in this family. The operations Damian's kept clean by having me run the parts that aren't." His voice was very flat. "I built those operations. I have 7 years in them. If my father has decided to outsource that function to Voss's organization, then what happens to you?" "Then I become a liability." He said it without apparent emotion, the way you say things that you've had time to sit with long enough that the fear has gone out of them, and what's left is just the fact. A liability who knows too much about the Ashcroft Empire's underside to be left walking around freely. The bar noise, low music, murmured conversations, the clink of glasses, suddenly felt very far away. "You think your father would—" "I think my father has made every major decision of his life based on the calculation of what serves him best." He finally looked up at her directly. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I've been making myself useful enough that the calculation always came out the same way. If that changes, Kael. She leaned forward, kept her voice low. This is your family. The expression that crossed his face then was brief and nearly invisible and more painful than anything she'd seen on him yet. Yeah, he said. I know. She sat with that for a moment. So what do you do? I'm figuring that out. He looked at her. I also need you to be careful. Why? Because if Voss is getting information about my operation, some of that information involves people connected to me, peripherally connected. A pause. You've been seen with me. At the gala. At Damian's building. People who track these things track all of it. I'm a yoga instructor, she said. I'm not. You're the woman Kael Ashcroft can't stop being in the same room with. He said it without softness or apology, just as information. To certain people, that makes you relevant. She felt the cold settle in, not dramatic, just slow and specific, like water finding level. You're telling me I'm in danger. I'm telling you to be aware. Lock your apartment. Don't walk to your car alone after dark. Let someone know your schedule. He looked at the table. I should have told you this 2 weeks ago. I didn't because I was trying to... He stopped. To what? A long pause. To stay out of your life. He said it quietly. I've been doing a very bad job of it. She could feel the pull of the thing between them like a physical force, steady and patient and entirely indifferent to whether she thought it was a good idea. She pressed both palms flat on the table. How bad is this going to get? She asked. I don't know yet. That's not reassuring. No. He met her eyes. It's not. She drove home with both hands on the wheel and checked her rearview mirror more than usual and hated herself for doing it, and checked it again. Her apartment was a third-floor walk-up in Ukrainian Village, not a neighborhood anyone associated with the Ashcroft name, which had always felt like anonymity and now felt less certain. She checked the lock on her door twice. She checked the window latches. She left the light on in the kitchen. She was still awake at 1 a.m. when her phone lit up with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Stay away from Kael Ashcroft. This is the only time we'll ask nicely. She screenshot it, sent it to Kael. His response came in 40 seconds. 3 words. Don't leave yet. 20 minutes later, she heard the knock. He was at her door in the same gray shirt, now with a jacket over it, and behind him in the hallway was a man she didn't know, late 40s, thick through the neck, who stationed himself at the top of the stairs with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd been doing this kind of thing long enough that he'd learned how to stand in a way that didn't invite notice. Kael stepped inside. She closed the door. He looked at her apartment, not critically, just the scan, the same reflexive threat assessment sweep she'd noticed from the beginning. 2 windows in the main room, 1 in the kitchen, fire escape on the left side. She could see him processing it. Pack a bag, he said. I'm not packing a bag. Selene, explain to me first. She crossed her arms. Who sent that text? Someone working for Voss. Or someone who wants me to think it's Voss. He ran a hand over his jaw. He hadn't shaved in a few days, and the stubble made him look older, more worn down, more like what he actually was instead of the contained, precise version he usually performed. Either way, they've located you. This address. How? I don't know yet. That's what worries me. He looked at her directly. This isn't a precaution. This is me telling you that staying in this apartment tonight is a bad idea. She looked around her apartment, the orange lamp on the bookshelf she'd bought at a street market, the stack of anatomy books she used for her teaching, the photograph on the wall that was the only one she had of her mother, taken 3 years before her mother died of something ordinary and terrible when Selene was 22. The small accumulated evidence of a life she'd built carefully and alone. Where? She said. A place I use when I need somewhere nobody connects to me. Out past Evanston. Safe house isn't the right word. It's just a house. He paused. You'll have your own room. I'll have someone there. It's temporary, until I can figure out where this text came from and neutralize it. Neutralize it, she repeated. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Thought about the text on her phone. Thought about the man at the top of her stairs. Thought about Kael in a parking garage. About a kiss that had detonated 14 months of carefully maintained stability. About Damian's controlled footsteps and warm hands and the awful dignity of his goodbye. She thought about what Kael had said in Marin's. "I've been doing a very bad job of staying out of your life." 30 minutes, she said. "I need 30 minutes. He nodded, sat down on her couch without being invited, put his elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor while she packed. She called Petra. Got voicemail. Left a message that said she was going out of town for a few days for a work thing, and would explain later, which was both a lie and the truest thing she could say given the circumstances. She packed practical things, clothes, her laptop, her medication, the small notebook she'd been writing in since she was 19, and that she took everywhere not because she wrote in it often, but because its presence felt like continuity. She packed as if she might not be back for a while, and then hated herself for packing that way, and put 2 things back to prove a point, and then took them out again because the point was stupid. When she came back to the main room with her bag, Kael was on his phone, speaking in a low, rapid sequence of phrases that meant nothing to her but seemed to produce rapid compliance on the other end. He ended the call and stood. "Ready?" he said. She looked around her apartment one more time. The orange lamp, the books, her mother's photograph. "No," she said, "but let's go." They went down the stairs and out through the back, avoiding the street-level front entrance at Kael's direction, moving through the building's service corridor and out into the alley behind the building where a car she didn't recognize was idling. The man from the hallway materialized from somewhere and got in the front. Kael got in the back with her and the car moved without ceremony into Chicago's midnight streets. She watched her neighborhood slide past through tinted windows. The coffee place she went to on Sunday mornings. The dry cleaner who knew her name. The corner where she'd had a long, laughing conversation with a stranger about their dog once, years ago, on an evening when she'd been lonely enough that the exchange had felt like mercy. Ordinary life. Receding. "Tell me about the house," she said. "Old farmhouse. About 40 minutes. Small. Kitchen. 2 rooms. A porch." He was looking out his own window. "I bought it 3 years ago. Nobody who knows me officially knows about it." "Why did you buy it?" A pause. "In case I ever needed to disappear." She absorbed that. "Have you?" "Disappeared?" "Not yet." His voice was quiet. "Been close twice." She turned and looked at his profile in the passing streetlights. The scar across his knuckles, visible where his hand rested on his knee. The set of his jaw, that permanent quality of bracing. The tiredness she'd noticed in Marin's that was still there, heavier now in the dark. "What are you going to do?" she said. "About your father. About Voss. I need to find out what they agreed to. What my father gave away and what he got for it." He turned and looked at her. "If he's pulled the structural support from my operations without warning, there'll be fallout before I can contain it. The people who operate under me. They don't know about the Voss arrangement. If Voss's people start moving into their territory, there'll be violence. Yes. And you'd be responsible for that." Something crossed his face. "I'm responsible for all of it." He said it without drama or self-pity, just with the weight of a man who had made a series of decisions long ago and had been living inside their consequences ever since. "That was the deal I made. I run the parts that can't be run cleanly so Damian could inherit something that looked like a legitimate empire." "Did Damian know what you were doing? How fully?" A pause that was its own answer before the words came. "Not fully. I kept it that way on purpose." He looked back out his window. "He's not. Damian isn't built for the knowledge. He can tolerate knowing certain things exist. He can't tolerate knowing exactly what shape they take." She thought about Damian in the coffee shop, his careful hands flat on the table. "He was going to propose," she said. Kael went very still. "He'd been looking at rings," she continued. "He mentioned it to me once, offhand, the way people do when they're working up to something." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I'd been trying to figure out how to feel ready for it." "Were you?" "I don't know." A long pause. "I think I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know it was this." She gestured vaguely at the space between them and felt slightly ridiculous doing it, but he seemed to understand. "Selene." His voice had changed, quieter, more careful. "What happened in that garage? I should have—" "Don't." She looked at him. "Don't apologize for it. It'll make it worse." He looked back at her, and the streetlights moved across his face in intervals, and she thought that in different circumstances, In a story where nobody got hurt and no families collapsed and nobody built criminal networks under their legitimate ones, he might have been someone she met honestly and chose without consequence. But this was the story they were in. The car left the city behind. The lights thinned. The road opened up into something dark and flat and Midwestern. November fields on both sides, a sky with no cloud cover and more stars than Chicago ever showed. She must have drifted because she startled when the car stopped and Kael's voice, low and close, said her name. The house was small, as advertised. White clapboard, a front porch with 2 wooden chairs surrounded on 3 sides by dark trees. A light was already on inside. Someone had been sent ahead. Kael's man from the front seat disappeared around the side of the building to do whatever people like him did to make sure a place was clear. She stood on the porch while Kael unlocked the door and thought, this is the moment, right here. If she wanted to preserve anything, any remaining fiction of the life she'd had 3 weeks ago, any possibility of returning to ordinary and safe and warm-handed stability, this was the moment to say she'd changed her mind and call a car and go back to her apartment and take her chances with an anonymous text message. She thought about it seriously. Kael pushed the door open and the warm light spilled out, and he turned and looked at her, standing on the porch with her bag and her expression and whatever she was visibly working through. He didn't rush her, didn't speak, just waited, with the particular patience of a man who had learned that the most consequential things either happen or they don't, and pressure makes no difference either way. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her, and her phone, face up on the small table beside the door where she'd set it while removing her coat, lit up with a text from Damian's number that she saw but didn't reach for immediately because Kael had gone still in a way that meant he'd seen it too, and the name on the screen sat between them like the thing it was. A door she'd walked through that was now shut permanently behind her. No handle on this side, no going back through. The text read, I know where you are. We need to talk. Not about us. About Kael. About what he did to our family. You need to know the truth before you trust him with your life. He's not who you think he is. He's not protecting anyone. Call me. Selene picked up the phone. Read it again. Set it back down. Kael was watching her from the kitchen doorway. His expression was unreadable, which was not the same as empty. She knew the difference now, knew that his unreadable was not absence but compression. Everything held down under enormous. Selene picked the phone up a second time. Read Damian's text again, word by word, the way you read something when your first pass felt too fast to be reliable. The screen light was cold and blue in the dim farmhouse kitchen, and outside the windows there was nothing. No city, no traffic, no ambient noise of civilization, just the particular absolute dark of rural November that made the house feel smaller than it was. She set the phone face down. Kael hadn't moved from the kitchen doorway. His arms were crossed, not defensively, more like he needed something to do with them while he waited. His eyes were on her face. You read it, she said. Yes. And I'm waiting to see what you do with it. His voice was even. Not performing evenness, actually even, with the specific quality of a man who had anticipated this exact moment and had made his peace with how it might go before it arrived. You can call him. I won't stop you. That's not the part I'm deciding, she said. What part are you deciding? She looked at the phone on the table, then at him. Whether any of what he's saying is true. Something shifted in the set of his jaw. Not guilt. Not quite. More like the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for so long that when someone finally names it, the naming is almost a relief and almost unbearable at the same time. He moved into the kitchen and sat down at the small wooden table, pulling out the chair across from where she was standing, and he folded his hands on the tabletop and looked at them. Ask me, he said. What did you do to your family? Which part? Start with the part that made Damian send that text at midnight. He was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator in the corner hummed. Outside, a branch moved against the window glass in the wind. 4 years ago, Kael said, my father was facing a federal investigation. SEC irregularities, some laundering allegations, nothing that would have stuck if it had gone through normal channels. Good lawyers, managed disclosures, the usual. He paused. But one of the investigators had something personal, a vendetta. He was building a parallel case outside official channels, feeding information to a journalist at the Tribune. If it had gone public the way he planned, the investigation would have been reopened with media pressure behind it. Different outcome. What happened to the investigator? Selene said. Kael looked at his hands. He had an accident. The kitchen was very quiet. What kind of accident? The kind that ended his career and put him in a hospital for 6 weeks and scared him badly enough that he retired to Arizona and has not spoken publicly about the Ashcroft name since. He looked up at her. He's alive. He's fine. I want to be specific about that. But you put him there. I had it arranged, yes. She pulled out the other chair and sat down because standing felt suddenly like too much effort. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at the grain of the wood. Damian knows this. Damian found out 2 years ago. Partial version. Enough. Kael's voice hadn't changed. Still even, still flat, still that same tone of a man reading from a document he'd written himself and had no illusions about. He confronted me. It was bad. He decided to believe that I'd made the decision without his father's knowledge, that it was me acting unilaterally to protect the family. Was it? A pause that was 3 seconds too long. No, Kael said. My father asked me to handle it. Those were his exact words. Handle it. He didn't want to know the method. He looked at the table. He never wants to know the method. Selene pressed her fingertips harder into the wood grain. And there's more than this. Yes. How much more? He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He was watching her face with an expression that was the closest thing to vulnerable she'd ever seen on him, which was not very close but was real. Something behind the eyes that knew what it was about to cost him and was spending it anyway. The Meridian Group, he said. Voss's people. The reason I knew about them, the reason I've had a boundary arrangement with them for 6 years. It's not because I was protecting the family from them. A pause. It's because I built a working arrangement with them. I use their distribution infrastructure. They use the access I have to Ashcroft accounts for washing certain transactions. Selene didn't speak. The FBI investigation that's been building against the Ashcroft name, he continued, it's not just about my father's old irregularities. It's about the arrangement with Meridian, which means it's about me. I am the thing that the FBI is actually building toward. He looked at her directly. My father knows this. He's known for 8 months. The meeting with Voss, I think he's been negotiating with them to hand me over, to make me the single point of accountability for everything the family's done. Cut me loose, cooperate with federal investigators, let the legitimate empire survive. The silence that followed this was different from the silences before it, heavier, more specific. Your own father, she said. He's done it before, in smaller ways. Kael said it without heat. I've always known this was possible. I built the operations the way I built them because I thought the arrangement was mutual, that he needed me enough. He stopped. His jaw moved. I miscalculated. Selene stood up abruptly, went to the kitchen window and looked out at the dark. Her reflection looked back at her, overlaid on the black nothing of the fields outside, face pale, hair loose from where she'd pulled the pins on the drive, eyes that looked like someone in the aftermath of something rather than the middle of it, which was wrong because she was very much in the middle of it. Damian doesn't know about Meridian, she said. No. So when he says you're not who I think you are, he's telling me about the investigator, the accident. Most likely, he doesn't know the full scope. A pause. Or he didn't. If my father has started talking to federal contacts to arrange his own protection, Damian may know more now than he did. She turned from the window. Call him. What? Call Damian, right now. Find out what he knows. Something moved across Kael's face. You need to know what your father has already told people. You need to know where you stand before morning. She crossed her arms. And he texted me, which means he's awake, which means he's been awake for a while thinking about this. Call him. Kael looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone. The call connected on the second ring. Damian's voice came through the speaker quiet and precise. I figured she'd tell you. Where are you? Kael said. My apartment. A pause. Father called me tonight, 3 hours ago. Another pause, longer, and in it Selene could hear the specific sound of Damian Ashcroft assembling words with extreme care the way he always did, measuring and weighing before releasing them. He told me about the federal situation, about Meridian, about what you've built. Everything. Enough. A sound that might have been a quiet exhale. He's meeting with a federal prosecutor Thursday morning. He has a lawyer. He has documentation he's been preparing for. Kael, he's been preparing this for months. The silence from Kael's side was absolute. He's offering them everything on Meridian, Damian continued. Your operational history, financial records, names of people in the arrangement, in exchange for immunity for the legitimate business holdings, and for me. A pause that felt like it cost him something. He's not including you in the immunity deal. Kael's hand was flat on the table. Selene could see the tendons in it, standing out against the surface. He's going to let them take me, Kael said. Not a question. Yes. Damian's voice cracked on the single syllable. Just slightly, just enough. Kael, I didn't know any of it. The Meridian thing, I didn't know. I knew about the investigator, and I let myself believe what I needed to believe about that. But this, his voice steadied with visible effort. I'm not going to let him do this. Damian, I have copies of his communications with the prosecutor's office. I have documentation that proves he initiated and directed the Meridian arrangement before you ever built anything. He didn't just tolerate it, he funded the initial infrastructure. The voice on the other end was controlled now, cold in the way that only the genuinely enraged go cold. He's been planning to use you as the exit strategy for at least 2 years, maybe longer. Kael closed his eyes. Selene watched him do it, watched his face do the thing it did when something got through the containment. Not collapse, but a kind of stilling, like a mechanism that has taken a hit and is running a rapid internal assessment to determine whether it can continue operating. Where did you get the documentation? Kael said. Does it matter? Yes. Father's personal server. I've had access since I was made CFO. He never changed my credentials. I don't know if he forgot or... Damian stopped. Or if he wanted me to find it eventually. I don't know what he wanted. Send me everything. I already sent it to your encrypted account. It's there. A pause. Kael, you have until Thursday. That's 41 hours. The call ended. Kael sat at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand for a long moment. Then he set it down carefully, precisely, like a man putting down something that might break if he wasn't deliberate about it. He pressed both hands flat on the table, stared at the space between them. Selene said nothing. She understood instinctively that there was nothing useful to say into this particular silence, that he needed the 45 seconds, or the 2 minutes, or however long it took for the full weight of it to move from the part of his mind that processed information to the part that felt what the information meant. Then his head came up. I need to make some calls, he said. Okay? You should sleep if you can. I won't be able to. He looked at her. For a moment, something flickered in his expression that was warmer than anything the situation warranted. A specific, involuntary acknowledgement that she was here, in this house, in this night with him, and that it meant something he didn't have room to examine right now, but wasn't pretending away either. There's a room at the end of the hall, he said. The bed's made. The closet has blankets. Kael. He looked at her. How bad is Thursday? The flicker closed. The containment came back down, smooth and total. Bad enough, he said. But I've been in bad enough before. She went to the room at the end of the hall. She lay down on the bed with her clothes on and listened to the low sound of his voice from the kitchen, words she couldn't make out, a series of calls that went on for a long time. She tracked her own breathing. In for 4, out for 4, the technique she gave to anxious students who needed something mechanical to hold on to when their nervous systems were firing past the point of voluntary control. At some point, the kitchen went quiet. At some point, she slept. She woke at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of something that wasn't quite a knock, more like 2 rapid impacts against the outside of the house, low and hard, followed by silence, followed by Kael's voice somewhere close saying a single word she didn't catch. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious. The hallway was dark. The kitchen light was on. She moved toward it, and Kael met her in the doorway, already in his jacket, already somewhere beyond the tired, controlled quality of the night before. He was operating now, whatever that meant for him, the switch fully thrown, his eyes moving past her to confirm the bedroom window was latched. 2 cars, he said quietly. At the end of the drive. They've been there for 20 minutes. Nolan saw them on the perimeter camera. Nolan, the man from the front seat. Your man. He's positioned at the back of the house. There's a third person in the tree line on the east side. He spotted them 5 minutes ago. Kael handed her a phone. Not his, a different one. Basic. If something happens and we get separated, there's one number in that phone. Call it. The person who answers will know what to do. What's happening? My father moved the meeting up. His voice was flat and fast. He didn't wait until Thursday. He gave the federal people enough last night to get a warrant, and he gave Voss's people this location as a prearrangement, a gesture of good faith. He looked at her, and the expression on his face in the kitchen light was something she would not forget. Not fear, nothing as simple as fear, but a kind of cold, total clarity that came from having the last illusion stripped away. My father told Voss's people where I was. He gave them this address, tonight. Selene's mouth went dry. The Meridian Group, they don't want me in federal custody. He was moving as he talked, checking his own phone, moving to the kitchen window and standing to the side of it to look out at the dark driveway without being visible from outside. A federal case involving me means their operations get examined. Their names come up. They'd rather... He stopped. He looked at her directly. They'd rather I wasn't available for federal examination. The cold had nothing to do with November anymore. So your father... She stopped. Started over. He arranged for Voss's people to come here before the federal meeting so that you'd be... Handled, Kael said. Yes. The word sat in the kitchen like a physical thing. Selene thought about the oil portraits in the Ashcroft entry hall, the dead men with their authority and contempt. Everett Ashcroft standing at the head of the dining room table, tasting her name in his mouth. So is everyone who has something to hide. He's your father, she said. It came out less like a statement and more like a refusal to accept the geometry of what she was being told. He's a man who made an investment 20 years ago that stopped returning what he needed. Kael's voice was completely without emotion now, which was the most frightening version of him she'd encountered, and she'd been cataloging versions for weeks. He's cutting the position. That's all it is to him. A sound from outside. Not loud, just wrong. A car door, maybe. Or something else. Kael moved fast. He went to the cabinet above the refrigerator and came down with a handgun that he checked with the rapid automaticity of muscle memory, magazine, chamber, safety, tuck at his back. He handed her the phone again. She was still holding it, she realized, had been gripping it since he'd given it to her. Kitchen door leads to the back porch, he said. Nolan will be there. If I tell you to go with Nolan, you go. You don't wait. You don't ask. You go. And you. I'm going to go talk to whoever's in those cars. Kael, I know these people. His voice sharpened slightly, not at her, just the cut of urgency. I built arrangements with half of Voss's network. There are people in those cars who I have history with. I can talk to this. He stopped, looked at her. 1 second, 2, the particular quality of a look from a man who is calculating rapidly, but is also, underneath the calculation, human enough to acknowledge that the person in front of him is real. I need you to trust me for about 30 minutes. She looked at him, at the scar on his knuckles, at the gun at his back, at his face in the kitchen light of a farmhouse in the middle of November. Dark, 41 hours collapsed down to nothing. His father's arranged betrayal already in motion around them. And she thought, this is the thing she hadn't seen in Damian. This specific, terrible, unbeautiful realness. The thing that was the opposite of tailored suits and warm hands and careful steadiness. The thing that was, she understood with the precise, unwanted clarity of a moment that cuts through everything. What she had been moving toward since the rain and the dining room and the scar across the knuckles of a man who carried the storm in with him. 30 minutes, she said. He moved to the front of the house. She stayed in the kitchen. She could hear voices outside, low and male, the particular tenor of a conversation happening outdoors in cold air between people who were being careful not to raise their voices. Kael's voice, recognizable, controlled, direct, no indication from tone alone whether this was a negotiation or something past that. Another voice she didn't know. Then a third, rougher. She counted her breaths, looked at the phone in her hand, looked at the kitchen door that led to the back porch and Nolan. 7 minutes in, the voices outside went quiet. Not the quiet of resolution, the wrong kind of quiet. Then 3 things happened in very fast succession that she would later recall only in fragments. The front window of the house imploded inward in an explosion of glass and cold air. Kael's voice from the front of the house shouted something single-syllabic and urgent, and the kitchen door burst open from the outside to reveal Nolan, his face with a cut across the cheek already sheeting dark, his hand out toward her with the palm up in the universal gesture of someone who needs you to move immediately and without discussion. She moved. The porch boards were cold through her socks. The air was a physical assault, 20-something degrees and still, and she registered the dark and the tree line and 2 more figures moving fast at the edge of it, while Nolan kept her moving toward a car at the side of the property she hadn't known was there. From inside the house, she could hear the specific sounds that she had no experience with, but her body identified correctly anyway. Impacts, furniture, a sound that was not words. "Get in," Nolan said. "Kael, he told me to get you out. I'm getting you out." He had his own gun in his other hand, pointed at the ground, scanning the tree line. "Get in the car." "Is he—" "Get in the car, Ms. Vale." She got in the car. Nolan got in beside her, and the car was already moving before the doors were fully closed, bouncing over the unmaintained edge of the property and onto a dirt track she hadn't known existed, headlights off, moving by whatever combination of memory and moonlight Nolan was using to navigate. She twisted and looked through the rear window. The farmhouse was lit from the front with something other than its interior lights, harsh, sweeping, the kind of light that moved. One of the upstairs windows showed something orange that wasn't warm. "Is that fire?" she said. Her voice sounded strange to her, flat and specific in the way voices go when the body is running a crisis protocol and has rerouted resources from affect to function. Nolan didn't answer. "Is Kael? He knows how to handle himself," said with the compressed conviction of someone who needed it to be true. The dirt track ended at a paved county road. Nolan turned east without hesitating and accelerated, headlights on now, the dark fields on both sides swallowing everything behind them. Selene pressed the basic phone Kael had given her against her collarbone and felt her heartbeat against her palm and watched the darkness move past the windows and tried to locate, somewhere in the machinery of herself, something that was not terror. She found something adjacent to it, something harder. Her phone, her actual phone in her jacket pocket, buzzed. She pulled it out. "Damian." She answered. "They hit the house," she said before he could speak. A pause. "I know, I'm watching it on. I have someone watching the property. Are you out?" "I'm out. Nolan has me." "Kael." She looked through the rear window again. The horizon behind them was faintly lit, irregular light against the cloud base, the kind of glow that meant something was burning. "I don't know," she said. Damian's breathing on the other end was audible. Controlled, as always, but audible. "I'm coming to you. Tell Nolan to take you to the Waukegan address. He'll know it. Don't go anywhere else. Don't contact anyone else." A pause. "Selene, I'm here. My father didn't just sell Kael to Voss. His voice was quiet and precise and completely destroyed. He told Voss that Kael had been cooperating with the FBI since last year, that Kael was the one who built the federal case against Meridian's operations." Another pause. "It's not true. My father fabricated the cooperation, but Voss doesn't know that. As far as Voss's people are concerned, Kael is the man who burned their entire network." She understood then what the burning farmhouse meant, what the people in the cars had come for. "They think he betrayed them," she said. "My father made sure they'd think that, because a man Voss's organization believes is a federal informant doesn't get a trial." Damian's voice cracked clean through on the last word. "He's not trying to hand Kael to the federal government. He's trying to get Voss's people to—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Selene gripped the phone. The car moved through the dark. The glow on the horizon behind them slowly, gradually, disappeared as the distance increased, and the road curved, and Illinois put its flat body between her and whatever was happening in that farmhouse. Nolan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. His face gave nothing. She thought about Kael at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood, reading the geometry of his father's betrayal in real time. She thought about everything he'd built and protected and sacrificed and the deal he'd believed was mutual. She thought about what he'd said in the bar. I became the monster so Damian never had to. And she understood, with the specific gut-level comprehension that only arrives when everything abstract becomes suddenly, irreversibly concrete, that Everett Ashcroft had not merely decided to use his son as an exit strategy. He had built the exit strategy into the son from the beginning. The violence, the operations, the careful construction of Kael as the family's weapon, made, shaped, pointed, and always from the very first moment he was already intended to be expendable. Selene held that thought in both hands like something sharp the entire ride to Waukegan. The car moved through pre-dawn Illinois, and she sat rigid in the back seat with Nolan's profile in front of her, and Damian's last words still live in her ear, and the glow of the burning farmhouse finally, completely gone from the horizon behind them. Nolan pulled into a residential street in Waukegan at 6:22 a.m. and stopped in front of a gray two-story house set back from the road behind a chain-link fence that had seen better decades. The lights inside were on. A car she didn't recognize sat in the driveway. Damian was already there. He opened the front door before they reached the porch. He looked like a man who had not slept and had stopped pretending he might. He was in dark clothes, no jacket, his face stripped of everything it usually wore in public. The warmth, the practiced ease, the performed competence. What was underneath was rawer and younger and more frightened than anything she'd seen on him in 14 months together. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment that contained, compressed, the entire weight of the parking garage and the coffee shop and 14 months of something real that had been real and was now also, simultaneously, over. "You're okay," he said. "Yes." He stepped back. Let her in. The house's interior was bare and functional. A safe house in the practical sense, not staged for comfort. Folding table, 4 chairs, a laptop open, a tactical map of the greater Chicago metro area spread across the table surface with several points marked in red. A man Selene didn't know stood at the window with his arms crossed, late 30s, military posture, watching the street. He glanced at her arrival without comment and went back to watching. "Kael," she said. Damian moved to the table. His phone went dark at 5:53 a.m., 14 minutes after you got out. He pointed to the laptop. Last ping was from inside the property. He was still in the house. He was still... Her voice stopped. He was still moving. The ping wasn't stationary. Damian looked at the map, not at her. His jaw was tight enough to show the muscle along the angle of it. Nolan's people are trying to reestablish contact. The house is... There was a fire. We don't know the extent. He paused. We don't have a body confirmation. Those last 4 words. The man at the window turned his head slightly, registered her expression, turned back. Selene sat down in the nearest chair. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at the map with its red marks and tried to make her brain operate in straight lines. The fire was deliberate, she said. Yes. Voss's people. We think, or it was Kael, if he needed to destroy what was there. Documentation, equipment, he'd do that before he'd let it be found. Damian finally looked at her. He's done it before. A warehouse in Cicero, 2021. He burned it himself and walked out. So he could be... We don't know. Damian's voice was quiet and very controlled. I'm operating on the assumption that he's alive and moving, because the alternative is... I can't run the next 12 hours on the alternative assumption. She understood that. She pressed her palms harder on the table. Tell me about Thursday, she said. Your father's meeting. It's not Thursday anymore. Damian turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was an email chain. Top address, a .gov domain. The content partially redacted, but the timestamp visible. 11:47 p.m. last night. He moved it to this morning, 8 a.m. Federal Building downtown. He checked his watch. 90 minutes from now. Selene read what she could of the email. A name at the top. Everett Ashcroft. A reference to a cooperation agreement. A reference to documentation being transferred. He's giving them Kael's operational records, she said, and the Meridian network. and 3 names of federal officials who took payments from the Ashcroft accounts over the past decade. Damian's voice had gone to the cold place. He's giving them everything, in exchange for complete immunity for himself and for me and for the legitimate holdings. He paused. I didn't ask him to include me. I want to be clear about that. I know. Selene, I need you to know that. She looked at him. I know, Damian. He nodded once, tight and small. Looked back at the map. Your father fabricated the story about Kael being a federal informant, she said, to tell Voss. Yes. Which means Voss's people went to that farmhouse believing Kael burned their network. That's not a... They weren't going to take him somewhere. They were going to... I know what they were going to do. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then the phone on the table buzzed, and Nolan picked it up and listened for 8 seconds and said, "Copy," and set it down. Vehicle was spotted on Route 41 northbound, he said. Black Ford pickup. Matches the description of one of the cars from the property. One car, Damian said. One car heading north. The other 2 cars from the property went south toward the city. Why north? Selene said. Nobody answered immediately. The man at the window shifted his weight. Kael's voice, in her memory. There's one number in that phone, call it. She pulled out the basic phone he'd given her. The single contact in it was labeled with nothing. No name, just a number. She looked at it for a second and then called it. It rang twice. You're with Damian. Not a question. Kael's voice, low and compressed and unmistakably live. Something clenched hard in her chest and released. Yes, she said. Are you? Listen to me. His voice had the quality of someone moving while talking, each word landing with the slight displacement of physical effort. I'm on Route 41. I have one of Voss's people in the car. He was the one running the team at the property. His name is Brecht. He's going to tell me what my father told Voss and when. I need 20 minutes. Damian was across the table. He could hear it. His expression processed the live voice and went through something rapid and private. Your father's meeting is in 90 minutes, she said. I know. A sound in the background she couldn't identify. I need what Brecht knows before I can walk into that building with anything useful. If my father presents his cooperation package first, if he controls the narrative before I can present counter-documentation. Damian has the documentation. Your father's communications with the prosecutor. Damian's documentation proves my father knew about Meridian. It doesn't prove my father fabricated the informant story to Voss. That's separate. If I can get Brecht to confirm it on record, I can present that directly to the federal prosecutor this morning and blow the cooperation agreement apart before it's signed. His voice sharpened. Is Nolan with you? She passed the phone to Nolan. The 2 men spoke in quick, low sentences. Nolan wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to Damian. Damian looked at it, looked at the map, looked at the man by the window. 40 minutes, Nolan said. If we move now. Damian looked at Selene. I need to go. I know. You stay here with... I'm coming. Selene, he's your brother. She stood up. And your father is about to walk into a federal building and dismantle him. I am not staying in a safe house in Waukegan while that happens. She held his eyes. I'm coming. Something moved across Damian's face that was complicated and human and beyond her ability to fully read. Then he picked up his jacket. Don't get in the way, he said. I never get in the way, she said. I just don't leave. They moved. 2 cars. Nolan driving the first with Damian, the other man whose name she still didn't know driving the second with Selene. They crossed back into Chicago as the city was waking up. Commuter traffic building on the expressways. The skyline materializing out of the gray morning like a stage set being assembled. Gray sky and the smell of the lake and the specific cold of a November morning that didn't care about anything that was happening in any of the cars on any of the roads. They met Kael at an industrial parking structure off Navy Pier at 7:04 a.m. He was standing beside the black Ford pickup on the second level, and he looked like a man who had walked out of a burning building because he had walked out of a burning building. His jacket was torn at the left shoulder. There was blood on the side of his neck from something that had been addressed only approximately with what appeared to be a piece of his own shirt, and there was ash on his right forearm and the back of his right hand. He was upright. He was moving. His eyes were completely clear. In the truck's back seat, a man sat with his wrists fastened behind him to the headrest, heavy built, 50 or so, with a face that had seen the kind of life that leaves permanent documentation on bone structure. Brecht. Kael looked at Selene when she got out of the car. 1 second of something direct and unguarded that he shut down immediately. He looked at Damian. The brothers looked at each other for the first time since the parking garage. Nobody spoke for a moment that was doing a great deal of work in a short time. "You're alive," Damian said. "Working on it," Kael said. Damian's throat moved. He looked at his brother's neck, the blood, the torn jacket. "How bad?" "Surface. I've had worse." He moved past the personal inventory. "Did you bring the documentation?" Damian held up a sealed envelope. "Everything from Father's server. His communications with the prosecutor's office, the financial records tracing back his initial Meridian funding, 3 years of directives he sent you through encrypted channels that document he knew and authorized everything." Kael took the envelope, opened it, stood in the gray morning light of a parking structure, reading through the pages with the focused speed of a man who could process dense material fast and had very little time to do it. His jaw was set. The muscle along it flexed twice. "He has a lawyer," Damian said. "Who?" "Greer, from the Madigan firm."
"Greer's good." Kael turned a page. "But Greer doesn't know about the fabricated informant story. If that comes out during the meeting—" He stopped on a page, read it twice. His face did something very controlled. He backdated it. "What?"
"The cooperation agreement. He signed an initial letter of intent with the prosecutor's office 6 weeks ago." He held the page up. The date in the header was visible. 6 weeks, He was negotiating this while I was still running operations he directed. While men were still... He stopped himself, put the page back, closed the envelope. Okay, Damian repeated. "That's all you've got. What do you want me to say?" His voice was flat and very quiet, and the flatness of it was not calm. He made his decision. I'm going to make mine. He turned and opened the truck's rear door and looked at Brecht. Brecht looked back at him with the particular expression of a man doing rapid calculations about his situation and not arriving at comfortable conclusions. "Last chance," Kael said. "You give me a recorded confirmation of what Everett Ashcroft told Voss about me. Full detail, time and date, exact content. You do that voluntarily and you go. I cut you loose right here." "And if I don't," Brecht said, "then I walk into a federal building in 45 minutes and I tell them everything I know about Voss's operations, and I start with your name and your function and the specific events of last night, and you can explain to Voss why you're the reason his entire network becomes the subject of a federal investigation." A pause. "Your choice is between a man who will let you walk away right now and a federal prosecutor who will not." Brecht looked at Kael for a long moment. "You've got something to record it," Brecht said. Kael held up his phone. What followed was 6 minutes that Selene stood outside and did not listen to directly, watching the city over the parking structure's concrete railing, the morning traffic, a cargo ship moving in the distant gray strip of the lake, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. While inside the truck, a man with ash on his arm and blood on his neck extracted a recorded confirmation from a professional criminal who had come to a farmhouse at 5 in the morning to ensure that he did not leave it alive. When Kael stepped out of the truck, he had what he needed. He cut Brecht's restraints with a folding knife. Brecht got out, looked at all of them, looked specifically at Kael with an expression that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite respect, but was somewhere in the territory of both. "We're square," Brecht said. "We're square," Kael said. Brecht walked to the parking structure's stairwell and was gone. Damian watched him go. That was a significant risk. Everything today is a significant risk. Kael was already moving toward the cars. "How are we getting into the federal building?" "I have an appointment." Damian's voice had a quality Selene hadn't heard in it before. Harder, more direct. The social smoothness gone and something more structural underneath. "I called the prosecutor's office at 6 this morning and told them my father's cooperation documentation was incomplete and potentially falsified, and that I had counter-documentation I needed to present before any agreement was executed. They're expecting me at 7:45, he paused. "I didn't mention you." Kael looked at him. "I need to mention you now," Damian said. You need to be there in person with the recording and the documentation simultaneously. I can get you into the building as part of my representation. He met his brother's eyes. I need you to let me do this. The silence between the brothers was specific and loaded and had years of history inside it. Decades of resentment and sacrifice and love that had curdled and been rebuilt and been destroyed and was apparently being rebuilt again in a parking structure at 7 in the morning with ash and blood still present. You don't have to, Kael said. If you walk in with me, I know what I am. Damian's voice was very quiet. You've been covering for this family your entire life. You can let me cover for you once. Something moved through Kael's expression, fast and real and immediately contained. Selene stays here, he said. No, she said. Both brothers looked at her simultaneously. I have Brecht's confirmation on my phone, she said. She held up the basic phone Kael had given her. Kael handed it to me when he stepped out of the truck. I heard the whole thing. I'm a witness to the recording being made voluntarily. She looked at Kael. You need a civilian witness with no criminal operational history to corroborate the chain of custody on that recording, or Greer will tear it apart before it's played. Kael stared at her. I just spent 12 hours trying to keep you out of this. I know. You did a terrible job. She held his eyes. I'm coming. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was beginning to understand was his version of being overwhelmed. Not visible distress, but a particular stillness, like a mechanism that has received more input than it has protocols for and is running something improvised. Then he looked away and exhaled and said nothing, which was his version of yes. They arrived at the federal building on South Dearborn at 7:39 a.m. Everett Ashcroft's town car was already in the underground parking garage when they pulled in. Damian spotted it immediately, dark blue, the same one that had ferried the family to events for 20 years, the driver standing beside it with the patience of a man being paid to wait. The sight of it made Damian go very still in the front seat for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened the door. The lobby of the federal building was institutional marble and fluorescent competence. Security checkpoint, ID verification, a federal marshal behind glass who looked at the four of them. Damian in his dark coat, Kael in his torn jacket and evident damage, Selene in yesterday's clothes, Nolan with the tactical posture of someone who had very deliberately chosen not to bring anything that would flag a metal detector, with the professional neutrality of someone who had processed stranger arrivals. Damian gave his name, gave Kael's name, gave Selene's. The marshal checked something on his screen, made a call, waited. In the lobby's ambient noise, echoing footsteps, distant voices, the mechanical breath of the building's ventilation, Selene stood between the brothers and felt the specific gravity of the moment in her sternum, the weight of everything that had arrived at this point compressed into the physical space of a federal building lobby on a cold November morning. Kael was standing to her left. She could feel the heat coming off him. Not fever, just the particular thermal output of a body that had been running hard for hours on adrenaline and will. His breathing was controlled, but she could see it, the slight rise and fall, the deliberate pacing of it. He hadn't looked at her since the parking structure. She reached over without looking at him and pressed her hand briefly against the back of his, not holding it, just contact. 1 second. His hand turned slightly under hers, the barest response. Then the marshal came back on the line and said they were cleared to go up. The elevator opened on the 14th floor to a corridor of glass-walled offices and the specific atmosphere of institutional consequence, the kind of building where things were decided that dismantled other things. A young woman in a Navy suit met them, identified herself as the prosecutor's assistant, and led them down the corridor without commentary. At the far end, through a glass wall, Selene could see into a conference room. Everett Ashcroft was already seated at the table. He was in his best suit, silver tie, the white hair perfectly ordered. He had the posture of a man who had walked into rooms of power for 50 years and had never once walked out of them diminished. His lawyer, Greer, sat beside him, younger, sharp-faced, a legal pad already covered in notes. Everett looked up as they approached. His eyes moved from Damian to Kael. Something crossed his face. She watched it happen. It was not guilt. It was not regret. It was something more strategic. Rapid calculation, the assessment of an unexpected variable, the adjustment of a plan. He looked at Kael the way a man looks at a problem that was supposed to have been solved by other means and has instead walked into the room. Kael looked back at his father. His face gave nothing, absolutely nothing, but the hand that had turned briefly under Selene's in the lobby had, at some point between the elevator and this glass corridor, closed into a loose fist at his side, and she could see the knuckles of it, the scar across them, white as bone. The assistant opened the conference room door. The prosecutor, a woman in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and the eyes of someone who had heard everything and been surprised very rarely, looked up from her own legal pad, took in the room's sudden expansion, looked at Kael specifically, his jacket, the dried blood on his neck, and then at Damian with the expression of someone recalibrating. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, addressing Damian, "you indicated you had documentation relevant to this proceeding." "I do," Damian said, "and I have 2 additional witnesses." He set the envelope on the table. "I'd like to request that no agreement be executed until this material has been reviewed." Greer was already on his feet. "This is highly irregular." "Sit down, Mr. Greer." The prosecutor hadn't raised her voice. She looked at the envelope, then at Kael. "You're the other Mr. Ashcroft." "Yes," Kael said. "You look like you've had a difficult morning." "I have." She looked at him for a moment with those evaluating eyes. "Do you have something to add to your brother's documentation?" Kael put the phone on the table. "A recorded statement made voluntarily 45 minutes ago by an individual named Brecht, operational coordinator for the Meridian Group's Northwest Chicago network, confirming the specific content, date, and circumstances of a communication made by Everett Ashcroft to Harlan Voss, in which my father falsely represented me as a federal informant." He looked at his father, "which Voss then acted on last night." The prosecutor's eyes moved to Everett. Everett's face was a perfect mask. "That's a significant allegation," the prosecutor said. "It's a recorded confirmation," Kael said. "There's a difference." Greer began saying something rapid and procedural. Selene wasn't tracking it. She was watching Everett Ashcroft, who was watching his son. And in the climate-controlled, fluorescent-lit reality of a federal conference room, she finally saw the thing she'd been trying to name since the first night in the Ashcroft dining room. The thing beneath the authority and the silver hair and the oil portrait posture. It was cold. Not cruel, not malevolent, just cold. The specific, absolute cold of a man who had never once, in 70 years, made a decision based on anything except what it returned. Kael knew this. He had always known this. He'd built his entire life inside it anyway. "Mr. Ashcroft," the prosecutor said, and she was speaking to Everett now, her voice even and without particular heat. "I'm going to need to review this material before we proceed. I'm also going to need to understand the events of last night and your knowledge of or involvement in those events." She looked at Greer. "I'd suggest you advise your client carefully before he responds to anything." Greer put his hand on Everett's arm. Everett didn't look at Greer. He was still looking at Kael. And Kael was looking back at him across the conference table, in a room that smelled like institutional coffee and case files and the specific odor of reckoning, and his face was still giving nothing, but Selene was standing close enough to him to feel the slight shift in his breathing, slower now, deliberately slowed. And she understood that he was choosing, actively and in real time, not to let whatever was happening inside him cross into his face. Because whatever was happening inside him in this moment, looking at his father across a federal conference table with evidence of his own near murder on the table between them, that was his. Unreachable. Private. The one thing Everett Ashcroft's calculation had never accounted for and could never touch. "Kael!" The prosecutor's voice. Calm, professional, not without humanity. "I'm going to have some questions for you. The formal kind." She looked at the phone on the table. "But first I want to hear this recording." Kael reached forward, and from the other side of the table, Everett said, "Kael." His voice was the same as it had been at 70 dinner tables and 20 boardrooms in every corridor of the Ashcroft estate. Authoritative. Measured. The voice of a man who had spent a lifetime having the last word. Kael's hand stopped above the phone. The room was absolutely still. "You have no idea," Everett said quietly, "what I've protected you from. What was necessary." He said it with the conviction of a man who believed it completely. "Everything I did." "Play the recording," Kael said. not to his father, to the prosecutor. He pressed play and stepped back from the table, and Brecht's voice filled the conference room in the flat, specific language of someone confirming facts for a recorder. And Everett Ashcroft's face finally, for the first time in Selene's experience of it, lost its certainty. Not dramatically, not in collapse, but in the small structural way that a building begins to fail, from something internal, something that had been holding weight for a long time, and had now been told it no longer needed to. Brecht's voice filled the conference room for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Selene counted without meaning to. It was the same automatic mechanism that had counted the minutes in the parking garage, the seconds in the farmhouse hallway, the brain finding something measurable to hold on to while everything unmeasurable did what it was going to do regardless. The recording was clean. Brecht's voice was flat and specific, the voice of a professional man confirming professional facts without embellishment, and what it confirmed was this. Everett Ashcroft had contacted Harlan Voss 11 days ago through an intermediary. He had represented to Voss that Kael had been cooperating with federal investigators for 14 months. He had provided fabricated documentation to support this representation. He had given Voss the location of the farmhouse in exchange for an assurance that the matter would be handled before Thursday's federal meeting. Handled. The word sat in the conference room when the recording ended the way certain words sit, not dissipating, just present, doing its work in the silence. The prosecutor, whose name Selene had learned was Holloway, set down her pen. She had not written anything during the recording. She looked at Everett Ashcroft with the particular expression of someone who has spent a career hearing the worst of what people do to each other and has not become inured to it, merely practiced at not letting the response show until the appropriate moment. Greer leaned to his client and spoke quietly into his ear for approximately 20 seconds. Everett did not appear to be listening to Greer. He was looking at the phone on the table. Then he looked at Kael, who was standing to the left of the table with his arms at his sides and his face giving nothing, dried blood still present on the side of his neck. And the look that passed between father and son in that moment was something Selene would carry for a long time. Not dramatic, not the thunderous confrontation of people who had prepared speeches. Just two men looking at each other across the irreversible distance of what had been done. One of them waiting for the other to find something human inside himself, and the other finding, instead, the same cold calculation it had always been. "I want to revise my cooperation agreement," Everett said. To Holloway. Not to Kael. Not to Damian. To the prosecutor, as if the room contained only the people useful to him. "In light of new information, Mr. Ashcroft," Holloway's voice was measured and absolute, "I'd strongly advise you to stop talking until you've had a private conversation with your attorney." She looked at Greer. "Mr. Greer." Greer put his hand on Everett's arm again. This time Everett allowed himself to be guided. They were escorted to a separate room by the assistant in the Navy suit. When the conference room door closed behind them, the quality of the air changed. Selene became aware of her own breathing, the slight unsteadiness in it that she'd been suppressing for the past 40 minutes, and she pressed her back against the wall and let herself have 3 seconds of it before she controlled it back down. Holloway looked at Damian, then at Kael, then at the envelope of documentation on the table. "I'm going to need both of you to stay available today," she said. "Formally available. Do you understand what I mean?" "Yes," Damian said. "I'm also going to need the original recording device and a signed affidavit from—" She looked at Selene. "You were present for the recording." "Yes." "I'll need your name and contact information and a statement confirming the circumstances and voluntariness." She looked at Kael's neck. "And you need to see a doctor." "After," Kael said. "That's not a request." A beat. "After I give my statement." Holloway looked at him for a moment with those evaluating eyes. Something moved through them that wasn't quite sympathy, more like the professional acknowledgement of a specific kind of damage. "Fine," she said. "After your statement." What followed was 4 hours that Selene experienced in fragments, because her nervous system, having held itself together through a night and a morning of sustained crisis, began in the relative safety of a federal building to inform her of the costs it had been deferring. Her hands shook slightly while she gave her statement to a young attorney who typed with professional speed and asked questions in the neutral tone of someone trained to remove all judgment from their voice. She drank 3 cups of coffee from a machine in the hallway that produced something technically describable as coffee. She sat in a waiting room chair and looked at a wall and breathed. At noon, Nolan appeared in the doorway and told her Kael was being seen by a federal physician 2 floors up. At 12:40, Damian sat down in the chair beside her and they were quiet together for a long time in the way that people are quiet together when they have shared something too large and too recent to discuss yet. "He's going to be okay," Damian said finally, meaning Kael. "I know," she said. "Do you?" She looked at him. His profile was clean and tired, the practiced social architecture of his face fully down now, in a way she'd only seen twice before, once in the coffee shop and once in the parking garage. He looked, without the performance, younger and more genuinely himself than she had ever seen him. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what happened between us, for how it happened. I know you are." He looked at the wall. "I'm working on what that means to me. I'm not there yet." "Okay. It's not about Kael. I need you to know that. Even before, I think I knew something wasn't right. I think I wanted—" He stopped, started more carefully. "I think I wanted what we looked like more than I paid attention to what we were. That's on me." She considered that. "We were something real." "Yeah." A pause. "Just not the right real." She didn't argue with it. It was accurate, and accurate things deserve to be received without argument even when they cost something to hear. At 2:15 p.m., Holloway came to find them. What she relayed in the neutral, precise language of someone summarizing a developing legal situation was this. Everett Ashcroft's original cooperation agreement had been suspended pending investigation of the fabricated informant material and the events at the farmhouse property. Everett was being held in a separate facility for the duration of the preliminary review. Greer had been given 30 minutes with his client and had emerged from the meeting with the controlled expression of an attorney who had been presented with a situation that significantly exceeded his original brief. The federal case against the Meridian Network was being substantially restructured. Voss himself had been taken into custody at 8:40 that morning, which Holloway delivered without elaboration and which Selene processed with the understanding that this had been moving on its own track all morning while they'd been in the conference room. The Ashcroft legitimate holdings were under forensic financial review. That would take months. The outcome was not certain. What was being offered, provisionally and subject to full cooperation and complete disclosure, was a conditional immunity structure for Damian and for Kael that was narrower and more contingent than what Everett had arranged for himself and substantially more real, because it was not built on fabrication. "It's not clean," Holloway told them. "Nothing about this is going to be clean, but it's viable." Damian looked at the table. "My father." "Your father is facing charges that his attorney is going to have a very difficult time managing," Holloway said. Not unkindly. "I'm sorry, that's the accurate answer." Damian nodded once, small and tight and final. Kael came back from the physician's office at 3 p.m. with 7 stitches in the laceration on his neck that turned out to be more significant than surface, a bruised rib that the physician had described as something he should have had treated 6 hours ago, and the same expression he'd had leaving the conference room. Not relief, not triumph, not the release that the resolution of something long held should theoretically produce. Just a kind of stripped-down flatness, like a landscape after weather, where everything standing is what was strong enough to remain. He sat down across from her in the waiting room. Nolan had gone somewhere. Damian was with Holloway's team in another room. It was the first time they'd been alone since the farmhouse kitchen, since his voice through the phone saying, "You're with Damian," and the thing that had unclenched in her chest at the sound of it. 7 stitches, she said. The doctor seemed personally offended. I waited. He looked at his hands. The right one had been cleaned, the ash gone, the dried blood from the knuckles gone. Just the old scar, white and permanent. "How's the rib?" "Inconvenient." "That's not a medical assessment." "No." He looked up at her. The fluorescent waiting room light was unflattering to everyone, and he looked in it exactly like what he was. A man in his late 30s who had spent the night surviving something and the morning dismantling something, and who was now sitting in a federal building with the wreckage of his entire constructed life settled around him like debris after a demolition he'd triggered himself. "Selene, don't apologize," she said. "We went through this. I wasn't going to apologize." A pause. "I was going to say, you didn't have to come today. To the building. The witness angle, Damian could have managed, "You know that's not why I came." He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." She looked at his stitches, at the careful, precise line of them along the side of his neck, the slight swelling around the sutures, at the torn shoulder of his jacket that nobody had replaced because there was nothing to replace it with, and it didn't matter, and he hadn't mentioned it. At the 7 years of built architecture that had come down in a single morning, and the man sitting in the rubble of it who did not appear to need rescue and was not performing not needing it. She had been in a relationship with a man who was warm and careful and genuinely good, and it had been the right thing for a specific season of her life. And it was over. She was sitting across from a man who had done things she would never fully know about and carried damage she would never fully map, and who had looked at her in a dim hallway on a rainy night and told her she should be afraid, and had been, in the specific way that mattered, the most honest person she'd encountered in years. These were both true simultaneously. She had learned, slowly and at cost, not to require the world to resolve its contradictions before she agreed to live in it. "What happens now?" she said. "Months of legal process, full disclosure of the operational history, financial cooperation with the Federal Review." He said it like a list of tasks, practical, forward-facing. "I'll lose most of what I built, that's correct. That's what it should cost." And after the legal process. A long pause. He looked at the wall, at some middle distance that contained whatever he was working out. "I don't know what I am without the operations," he said, not with self-pity, genuinely, as a factual uncertainty. "I've been running them since I was 26. They're the structure everything else has been built around." He looked at his hands again. "I need to figure out who I am when I'm not being used as a weapon." She thought about his voice in the kitchen of the farmhouse. "I became the monster, so Damian never had to." She thought about Damian in the waiting room chair saying, "I think I wanted what we looked like." She thought about herself in her yoga studio, moving through sequences her body knew without her, running on autopilot, mistaking the absence of crisis for the presence of health. "That takes a while," she said, "figuring out who you are when you stop being whatever you made yourself into." She looked at him directly. "I spent 2 years on it, after the relationship before Damian." He looked at her, waiting. "I made myself very small," she said. "Very managed, very careful. I thought that was recovery." She paused. "It was just a different kind of armor." "Is that what Damian was?" She considered it honestly. "Partly. He was also genuinely good to me. Both things are true." She held Kael's eyes. "I'm not interested in finding another version of armor. I've had enough of that." Something shifted in his expression. Not the small, controlled flickers she'd learned to read over weeks of proximity. Something more open than that, something that came from further down. "I'm not safe," he said. "I know. I mean structurally. I don't know what I'm going to look like on the other side of this. I don't know what I'm capable of being without—" "I know," she said again. "I'm not asking you to know that yet." He looked at her for a long time without speaking, and she let him look. Didn't fill the silence, let it be what it was. 2 people in a waiting room in a federal building on the afternoon of the day that had dismantled everything they'd both been living inside of, sitting with the specific, unbeautiful fact of each other. "Okay," he said finally, quietly. "Just that." Outside, Chicago was continuing. She had forgotten, in the compression of the past 18 hours, that the city did this, that it simply continued, indifferent and enormous, absorbing catastrophes and reconstructions and the private devastations of its inhabitants without pause or acknowledgement. She stood at the building's entrance at 4 p.m. and looked at South Dearborn and the traffic and the November sky sitting low and gray and felt the reality of the ordinary world pressing back in at the edges like water finding a crack. Damian came out behind her. He stood beside her for a moment, looking at the same street. "I'm leaving," he said. "For a while. He stopped, started differently. "My lawyer says the cooperation process is going to take the better part of a year. I can do most of it remotely. I'm going to go somewhere that isn't Chicago for a while." He paused. "I think I need to not be an Ashcroft for a while. Just be Damian." She looked at him. "Where?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere with a different skyline."
a small sound that was almost fractionally a version of his old warmth. Maybe somewhere without a November. She put her hand on his arm briefly. He looked down at it, put his own hand over it for a moment, warm as always, and then released it. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too." He flagged a cab, got in. She watched the cab pull into traffic and disappear into the ordinary ongoing mass of the city.
She stood on the federal building steps and breathed cold air and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the grief of the thing with Damian and the ragged animal relief that everyone was alive, felt something else, smaller and more tentative, but real. The specific cautious sensation of something having been resolved that had been unresolved for a long time. Not happily, not cleanly, but completely. Kael came out 10 minutes later. He stood beside her on the steps. He'd gotten a new jacket from somewhere, one of Nolan's people probably, something dark and plain that fit approximately. The stitches were visible at the edge of his collar. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the street and breathed. And she could see the breathing. Deliberate, paced, the same thing she'd taught for years in the studio. The automatic effort of a body that had been running on crisis protocols for hours and was being carefully, manually brought down. "Nolan's getting the car," he said. "Okay. You need to go home. Sleep. You need to go to a hospital, properly. I went to a physician." "You went to a federal physician who gave you 7 stitches and ibuprofen. That's not the same thing." She looked at him sideways. "You have a bruised rib." "Bruised, not broken." The distinction stops being relevant after hour 3 of running on it. He looked at her, and despite everything, the stitches, the torn shoulder, the morning they'd just been through, the federal building at their backs, and the dismantled empire in their wake, something crossed his face that was warmer than she'd ever seen it and more genuine precisely because it was exhausted and had no performance left in it. "You're not going to let this go," he said. "No." A long pause. "Okay," he said. Same quiet word as the waiting room. Different weight in it now. Less the weight of uncertainty, more the weight of something being accepted. The car arrived. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Selene's life, which was saying something given what had preceded them. The federal process was exactly as consuming and procedurally grinding as Holloway had indicated. Kael's cooperation meant hours of depositions, document reviews, careful sessions with attorneys in rooms that smelled like paper and institutional carpet, where the past 7 years of his operational history were methodically laid out and examined and categorized, and where Selene occasionally sat outside the room because she was still technically a witness in the chain of custody and because leaving felt wrong. She reopened the studio. It had been closed for 4 days, a personal emergency per the note she'd left on the door, and her regulars returned without demanding explanation because the people who do yoga at 7 a.m. on weekdays are, as a demographic, practiced at accepting the surface of things. She moved through the sequences. She taught. She breathed. She let the ordinary rhythm of the work do what ordinary rhythms do. Hold the shape of a life while the interior of it is being rearranged. Everett Ashcroft was formally charged on a Thursday in December, 2 weeks and 3 days after the federal building meeting. Money laundering, conspiracy, obstruction, and 2 charges related to the fabricated informant documentation and the events at the farmhouse that his attorney was apparently having an extremely difficult time contextualizing sympathetically. The charges were read in a courtroom in the Dirksen Federal Building, and Everett Ashcroft, in his best suit and his silver tie, heard them with the same expression he had had across the conference table when the recording played. Not collapse. Just the structural failure of something that had been holding weight for a very long time and was finally, completely done doing it. Kael was not in the courtroom. He was in a coffee shop 4 blocks away, a place nobody knew him, sitting at a corner table with a cup he wasn't drinking, and Selene sat across from him and watched his face while he looked at his phone for the text from his attorney that confirmed the charges had been entered. He read it, set the phone down, looked at the table for a long time. "Okay," he said. It was the 3rd time she'd heard him say that word in the particular way he said it. Not as agreement or acknowledgement, but as a kind of internal reckoning, a door closing on something that needed to be closed. She was learning his language, the economy of it, the specific weight each word carried, the difference between his silences. "Do you want to leave?" she asked. "Not yet." He looked up. "I want to sit here for a minute." She sat with him. Outside the coffee shop window, Chicago moved through an ordinary December afternoon. People on phones, delivery trucks, a woman walking a very large dog, the gray sky pressing down on the tops of buildings with its usual winter authority. None of it modified itself for the occasion. The city didn't know or care that an empire had been formally named in a federal courtroom 4 blocks away. It simply continued, which was, Selene thought, either deeply indifferent or quietly merciful, depending on how you needed to receive it. Kael watched the street for a while. Then he said, "He called me once, when I was 19, my first semester at Northwestern. He told me the family was facing a problem, that he needed me to come home for the weekend and help him handle something. He was still watching the street, his voice low and even, the tone of someone accessing something stored at depth. I didn't ask what, I just went." A pause. "That was the first time I understood what I was to him, what I could be used for." Another pause, longer. "I went back to school on Monday, and I told myself it was a one-time thing, told myself it was family, that it was different when it was family." He looked at his hands on the table. 41 times in 12 years. She waited. I counted once. The number of times I'd gone home for a weekend and handled something. He looked up at her. 41. She held his eyes. "And now? Now it's 41 times too many, and it's over, and I have to..." He stopped. "I have to figure out what you do with that, how you carry it without letting it be all you are." "You live with it," she said. "That's the answer. Not clean, not resolved. You just live alongside it, and you try to make sure that what you do from here is different enough that the weight of it eventually changes." He looked at her. "I know because I've been carrying something for 10 years, she said. "The relationship before Damian, the things I let happen, the person I let myself become because I was too afraid to leave." She looked at the table. "I don't feel that weight the same way I used to. It didn't go away, I got other things too, and now it's not the only thing I'm holding." He was quiet for a while. "You teach people how to breathe," he said. "Yes." "For a living, people who have forgotten how. People who never learned, or who learned wrong." She looked at him. "Why?" A pause. Something in his expression that was the quietest version of himself she'd ever seen. The full containment finally, genuinely down, not performing openness, but actually open, in the way that only exhaustion and honesty and the aftermath of catastrophe can strip a person too. "I've been breathing wrong for a long time," he said. She reached across the table, put her hand over his. He turned his hand under hers and held it. They sat in the coffee shop for another hour. They didn't talk much. Outside the window, the city continued its indifferent, merciful ongoing, and the December light went from gray to the particular pale gold of late afternoon that Chicago produced sometimes in winter, reluctantly, as if offering something despite itself. The weeks became months. Damian sent a text from Lisbon in January, 3 words and a photograph of a different skyline, orange-roofed and unfamiliar and genuinely beautiful. Selene looked at the photograph for a long time, wrote back 2 words. He responded with a single punctuation mark that she interpreted correctly as acknowledgement and the beginnings of something like peace. The federal process moved with the grinding thoroughness of federal processes. Kael sat through it. He disclosed everything. He answered every question put to him with the same flat precision he'd applied to other forms of difficult work, and Selene watched him do it from the periphery and understood that this too was a form of carrying. Not easy, not redemptive in any simple way, just the sustained effort of a man paying what he owed. The conditional immunity held. It was narrow. It came with conditions and monitoring and a future that had very specific edges on it. His attorney told him it was the best outcome available given the operational scope. Kael thanked the attorney, which surprised the attorney, who had been expecting something closer to resentment. He'd been expecting the wrong thing because he didn't yet understand that Kael Ashcroft had stopped somewhere in the late fall of that year, needing the outcome to be different than it was. Everett died in federal custody 7 months later. A stroke, in the early morning, alone in a federal medical unit, in a room that did not contain oil portraits or mahogany or the ambient approval of rooms that had been built to confirm his significance. It was an ordinary death in an ordinary room, and when the call came, Kael was standing on the back porch of a different house. A small rental in the north of the city, nothing with history attached to it, nothing built to endure. And he stood there for a long time looking at the yard and the gray April sky. Selene came out and stood beside him. He told her. She said nothing. She stood close enough that their arms were in contact. After a while he said, "I spent a long time trying to be something he'd consider worth keeping." She waited. "I think that's the thing I'm going to spend the longest getting over." He looked at the sky. "Not the operations. Not the federal thing. That." A pause. The 19-year-old who drove home to help his father with a problem and thought it meant he was trusted. She thought about what she could say to that and found nothing adequate, and so she did what she had learned over months that he needed from her in the moments when language was insufficient. She stayed. Just stayed, present and physical and real, beside him in the ordinary morning of the yard. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. They stood there until the cold made them go inside. 6 months after that, in October, a full year after a rainy November night, and a dining room and a scar across a set of knuckles that she'd known from the first moment meant something. Selene drove north on a morning when the trees along the highway had gone to red and gold, and the lake appeared and disappeared through the tree line like a glimpsed secret. The cabin was small. 1 room and a kitchen and a porch. It sat at the edge of a property where the tree line broke open and gave onto a dock and a stretch of northern Wisconsin water that was still and gray in the October morning light. Kael was on the dock. He was standing at the end of it with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the water, and he hadn't heard her car pull in over the sound of the wind in the trees. He looked the way he looked when nobody was watching him. Not the performed containment, not the operational precision, not even the exhausted, stripped-down version she'd seen in the federal building waiting room. Just a man standing on a dock in October, breathing. She got out of the car. She walked down to the dock. He heard her footsteps on the boards and turned, and the expression on his face when he saw her was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a person. Not joy exactly, not relief, something quieter and more durable than either of those. Something that had been there under everything all along, and was only now, in the absence of all the structures they'd both been maintaining, visible in full. She walked to him. He opened his arms. She stepped into them and felt his arms come around her and his chin come down to the top of her head, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in the cold air and the water smell and the specific warmth of him that she had been moving toward. She understood now since a rainy night in November when he'd told her she should be afraid and had been the first person in a long time to tell her the true thing. They stood on the dock while the October water moved below them and the trees made sound in the wind behind them. "You came back," he said, quietly, against her hair. She didn't answer, because the answer was in the fact of her, there on the dock, in the October morning, in the year of cost and consequence, and the legal machinery, and Damian's Lisbon skyline, and Everett's ordinary death, and the 41 times and the 7 stitches, and all of it, that had been paid and survived and was not clean and not resolved and would never be the kind of story you told without complication. But she was here, and so was he, and under their feet the dock held.